What's this all about? You know I hate suspense.
Well, it has to do with my former job. As a restitution expert for the Transatlantic Returns Treaty, there have been some interesting developments.
The name of the treaty itself is a misnomer. It should be called the Colonial...
Terrible time for a history lesson, bud. Just go with the thing about the clause.
Right. There's an old clause in the treaty that uses the words public display.
Basically saying all artifacts that are currently on display to the public need to be returned.
Museums are now using that old clause to basically remove artifacts from public display under the auspices of changing exhibits, maintenance, etc. They don't intend to put these artifacts back on display and are also not disclosing what they have in storage. They intend to have these on display for private viewings instead.
Can't give back what you don't have.
Exactly. But that also means they cannot report the artifacts missing or stolen.
Stolen? Who is stealing them?
Us.
All right. Hello and welcome to Bad Art, a podcast about the uses and abuses of art in the 21st century. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock, here as always with
Mariel. Thanks for joining us today.
And today we're talking about Relooted, a video game by the indie producer Niam Kopp, in which you play part of a team that steals artifacts back from Western museums and repatriates them to the African countries where they have been taken from. And to tell us about this, we have a special guest today, Akil Fletcher, an expert in Black video game culture, who is going to tell us about this video game and more. So we're really excited to have Akil on the show. Welcome, Akil.
Thank you. Hey, lovely to be here.
Great to have you. All right, so we can go ahead and get started. Akil, do you mind starting us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying video games?
Yeah, so I guess formal introduction. My name is Dr. Akil Fletcher. I'm a Cotson postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University currently, and I've just accepted a tenure track position at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the CUNY system, which is a big yay because I came out of the CUNY system. I got into this because I grew up an avid gamer. I played video games. It was often the way that I connected with family and friends, both online and in my neighborhood. And through a very rigorous time in my life, I asked myself, what would make me happy, or how could I be happy? And it turned out that video games was the big answer. So I went to grad school, continued studying culture and video games more deeply, and it has, done me well enough. So here I am.
Great. And then I guess we have a follow-up question about Black video gaming in particular. I know this is perhaps a dumb question, but it's one that needs to be asked. What makes Black video gaming different from video gaming in general?
Yeah, it's not a dumb question at all. Actually, there'd be tons of Black people that would argue that it isn't different and that they just want to play, good video games in any of these cases. Unfortunately, though, that tends to fall along an assimilationist argument, which is perfectly fine. I think that video games should be made for everyone and can be enjoyed by everyone in some of these cases. But the things that make Black gaming different are the same things that make Black history or Black inventions or Black living different in any of these cases. It is born out of a unique histories where Black individuals didn't have the same access to video games. So if you look at things like Space War, one of the earlier video games that was created in MIT, while MIT was allowing Black people in there was a whole lot of behind the scenes stuff going along that meant that the rates of Black people going to MIT were significantly lower. So getting access to early computing programs, whether it be at MIT or within military bases, weren't necessarily as accessible for Black individuals. And that's sort of what, some researchers call the digital divide, referring more to the internet. But that sort of technical division between Black and non-Black individuals, specifically white individuals, would carry on post the sort of pinball era into the arcade scenes, where arcades didn't proliferate as fervently within Black neighborhoods. You might have a few consoles or booths here and there, but it just meant that the relationship Black people have had with video games have been very different. And even though Black people have often enjoyed or played or found places to, it's often meant that Black play has just been a more communal engagement where many of us would have to be around one booth or one console or playing Smash Bros or Street Fighter and many of these other aspects, in somebody's home and passing the controller after a loss because it just wasn't in abundance. And this is why you also have tons of Black people in the fighting game scene. So the difference between Black gaming and non-Black gaming is the reality that Black folks have had to develop different forms of play and engagement to have it.
That's really fascinating. Hearing that gaming carries over to some of the wider segregation legacies in the United States. We often talk about property or space in white spaces being much more individualized, a result of segregation in Black spaces, and it's wild to hear that this carries over into video gaming. That's really interesting. Well, why don't we start talking about this game? Is this a unique intervention, or is there a wider pattern of games developed with Black ideas behind them or Black audiences in mind?
It's becoming something that happens more frequently, but there's still so far and few in between. And I will give, I'm really not sure how to pronounce it. It's either Nyankapop or Nyankamo. It's they say it at the beginning of the game, but it's so fast that I never really catch it. I should get the correct pronunciation. Unfortunately, my South African pronunciations will be very, very weak. What Nyankapop has done is quite unique for lots of reasons. So Relooted, now that I've played through 99% of it, is essentially just a game about the sort of repatriation of African artifacts back to their original homelands or within the museum. So the Professor Grace that you start off with is one of the original masterminds behind this. And when you play through the game later on and you ask her why she's doing this, it says because she goes to the Museum of Black Civilization, which is in Senegal, one of museum that I've actually visited myself. And in this Afrofuturist setting, there was supposed to be a act of return for all of these artifacts, where every room, every artifact that was returned would light up a different section within this display. And when she went there, out of hundreds of different spots that were supposed to be lit up, only like 2 or 3 of them was lit up. So for her, it was a breaking point in which they're like, okay, clearly simply asking for our stuff back isn't going to be good enough. And then they use these legal loopholes in order to take back these artifacts.
This empty museum in Senegal, or mostly empty. Like this is a frequent thing in African countries where they have built museums for the return of artifacts that have been looted. And European countries in the US, where many of these artifacts are held, have resisted returning them. So you have these empty museums, or mostly empty museums, in places like Nigeria and Senegal that are there and waiting for the stolen goods to be returned. And there's been decades of delay despite promises that they would be returned eventually.
Yeah. It is very, very sad for the reasons that some of the cultural significance of these objects are being ignored, mostly for it to be showcased, right? So some of the objects that you take back, some who have already been returned and other aspects are, many of them have spiritual and ritualistic meaning, right? Many of them are masks or great, or basically like statues that are carved out to be tombstones, or even human remains, right? That just shows the sort of barbaric nature of what this sort of looting and colonialism that came along with the sort of scramble for Africa really meant, and really what it turned into. And even in some of the most modern day or perfect examples, right? Like one of the last items that you steal back is the Queen's scepter and crown, because of the massive diamonds, forgetting the name of them, that were some of the biggest diamonds, if not the biggest diamonds in the world, that were taken out of the African continent and put into the British ruling iconography, right? So these are things that we sort of sit with the specter of colonialism consistently, and this game does a very good job of saying like, hey, it's still there, we're still waiting for things. And I think for the fact that I'm not sure what year the game is played in, but the fact that we're working with an Afrofuturist setting where it's sort of depicting it being in the future also speaks volume, because it's saying like, hey, even after all this time, further from than what we're sitting, these objects still haven't been returned and they're still within litigation. So something has to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the speculative riff in the opener that we watched together, where it says all they've done is taken the items out of public display, right? Because that's definitely a trend that we see even in current museums today, that they don't want the heat from reminding people that they have these objects.
So Relooted, it's one of the first games that I've played that has felt like an edutainment game. Um, I guess what I would say would be like an evolution of an edutainment game. So if you've played things like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, or why am I forgetting the name of the trail game? Everyone played
Oregon
it.
Trail.
Oregon
Oh,
Trail, right?
did either of
They,
you ever play Amazon Trail?
I've
No.
never played the Amazon Trail. Oh my God.
Ah, Amazon Trail. You got to go around with like a little camera and photograph different species of like flora and fauna and learn about them. It was great.
That sounds fun. But yeah, so it's exactly so games like that, right? And this game very much of builds on that, and it introduces the the geographic location from where the artifacts come from. They tell you facts about the Benin Kingdom and all of the other African civilizations that have existed. They and very mindfully chose about 64 different artifacts that are pivotal to understanding African culture, or at least the importance or the uniqueness. When some of the folks were talking about the game itself, um, some of the developers they took very different artifacts from different regions to fight against the sort of homogenous thinking of Africa, where Africa often gets sort of this countrification where people think of Africa as just like this one thing where everybody's doing the same things, when in reality, obviously Africa is a very big and diverse continent. So they chose these artifacts, and it really, really helps out. But unlike those games that didn't have the technical capabilities to play the way this one does, it's not just like a click and point or just pressing a couple of buttons and moving along. There's a more active engagement where you can free run and jump and do your little parkour tricks, and then then you stop and you click on an artifact, and the professor tells you where it comes from, its significance to culture or ritual or any of these other aspects.
So I was thinking it would be interesting to talk about some of the objects in the game. I looked up some of the gaming objects. So one of the first things that you're asked to recover is the skull of Mangi Meli. This is like the actual skull of an African political leader who was hanged by the Germans during a rebellion in what is now northern Tanzania. And so his skull has disappeared into German collections. And so your
Yeah.
first task is to find it and retrieve it. The game has a nice little passage where one of the characters, and I'll play this.
What kind of a person collects heads?
She goes by Fraulein M, as politically connected as she is twisted. Heads, hands, teeth, she collects them all and displays them in her manner.
That's House of Horrors level where you have to go back and collect actual remains. And I believe that's also one where you don't there because there's a few objects that are actually not from the African continent. There's a Brazilian one because they also have a shrunken head from an Amazonian tribe there as well, or a replica of one, whichever. Um, yeah, so this is where I think the game really shines. It doesn't shy away from the horrors of it because, I mean, even in the US, people collected, toes, fingers of Black individuals. They send postcards of lynchings and other things like that. But obviously, the brutality was just as bad within the colonizing of the continent, where literal remains was taken, and we get such a whitewashing or sanitization of the histories of it that by removing these barbaric acts, they keep trying to soften the histories and the violence of what these things are. Having the game remind us of the lengths of this brutality is, while some could argue it could be a bit of suffering porn that we have continued to see in lots of like the black horror genre. I think it's a necessary, it is only a single level, and I think it's a necessary evil. I mean, a necessary level to talk about how badly these things happen.
Yeah. I was thinking, the Penn Museum, which is near me, and Anthropological Museum,
Yeah.
has gotten in a lot of fire lately for having a public display of skulls from formerly enslaved people, as well as not quite so public, but showing in classrooms the corpses of people who were murdered in the move bombing in 1985. So just it goes hand in hand actually with the looting of art, and the willingness to display devalued bodies becomes simultaneous in some way. And I think exposing that violence in the House of Horrors episode is a really strong statement.
Yeah, and I think I mean it's just horrible in many of these cases, which I think that museum deserves all the flack because Princeton also
Absolutely.
received that flack a couple of years back when they were displaying the remains of enslaved individuals, which you have to ask yourself, why do you have such easy access to the remains of enslaved individuals, right? In terms of phrenological study and other aspects where, black bodies were just used for the advancement of science, but you can easily go dig up the remains of some of the founding fathers right here in Princeton
Let's
and
do
use those skulls instead. You
it.
don't have there are plenty of non-black bodies that if you simply needed a cadaver or skeleton to display the passage of time on a body, that you did not have to use an enslaved individual, but yet the thinking still persists that these bodies are okay to just enact whatever things you want to do with them, whether it be something for an intellectual pursuit or anything else. Yeah, it's horrific, and it still shows black bodies, even in death, continue to be dehumanized and more often more useful, as Tanya Sutherland points out, more useful dead than we are alive sometimes. So, yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe we should have a sequel to Relooting made by a white studio that is a great, like, grave robbing white graves of the founding fathers game.
I would. That would be a much more Indiana Jones-esque, but I'm with it. Hey, if they want to make it, I'll play it.
So quickly to identify, there is another body, at least in the game, which is Broken Hill Man, which
Mhm.
is a prehistoric corpse. But nonetheless, I think a lot of people are more at ease with ancient bodies on display than contemporary bodies. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And I think the game is making a point to say, this body was also stolen from its resting place,
Mhm.
mined up and put on display again in a German museum. And we should be asking questions about that as well. So I appreciate the game having that in there. Um,
Yeah, I definitely agree. What is the limit of stature or whatever it's called in terms of when is it okay to take or remove bodies in some of these cases? I know whether it be, Homo neanderthalis or Homo erectus or whatever bones that we have, things get to like there's a distancing, but the same sort of historical, as you pointed out, the game making this point is that the same sort of logics that we use to distance ourselves from early hominids is the same logic that folks were using to distance whiteness from black people, right?
yeah,
It is that these are not fully human, and thus these bodies are okay to take and do whatever they like with. And
yeah. And then since the game is primarily about art, we could highlight at least one art object, which is the Benin bronzes. These are pretty well known. They're these incredible bronze works, which were looted from what is now Nigeria during the British invasion and distributed. They're now held in over 160 different museums, which makes the problem of repatriation much more thorny than for individual objects because each museum stalls in a different way. And some museums have loaned or given small pieces back. At one point, the British Museum sold Nigeria 30 of the bronzes on the basis that they were believed to be duplicates of ones they already had, so they didn't need them. But
yeah.
and now they've said that was a mistake. They shouldn't have given any back. So there's just this long problem of the artwork as well.
Yeah, I mean the British Museum is a nightmarish sort of institution. But the reality is that the Benin bronzes have become like the Pokemon cards of like museum collections in some of these cases where it's like, yeah, I'll sell you my second Charizard, but it's gonna make me money, right? Like I want one for collection and then I want to sell the other for 10,000. And it's fascinating because the removal of these bronzes again was to that point of like these people could not have made them, so let's sort of hide them away and scurry them back. And then when they do, acknowledge them, it is sort of like this one unique empire and kingdom that is able to create this work. And thus, like, it's so nice. It's a little too nice for you to have. So we should take care of them, and we should have them in some of these cases. They are beautiful work, but there are literal manifestations of the capabilities of the bronze work of, if not the Benin Empire. The bronzes are little manifestations of like the beauty, the culture, and the capabilities and the ingenuity of that people. One that, now literally funnels, the continued profits of European and Western countries. So
Yeah. So just because I have it here, you said, selling your Pokemon cards for $10,000. The record sale for a Benin Bronze was 2015 for 10 million pounds.
yeah,
So that's probably like $20 million to a private collector. So taken out of the public sphere once again. And
yeah, to a private collector. Wow. Yeah, that's awful. And I don't think even a Pokemon Illustrator card, which one of the rarest, if not the rarest, card in circulation, is going to sell for that. So, give it back. Give it back. Just let
yeah.
people have their stuff. In fact, and if you're going to keep them, reparations. Just I think the
Reparations
item.
and give them back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that you owe back, like, you made a lot of money off of people walking in and seeing these things consistently. Give back, give them back and give your money back. That's fine.
I mean, the sale to a private collector is especially galling, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't even engage with any of the arguments around what is the right of the British Museum to have these bronzes. It's just like, oh no, we stole it. Now we're going to make some money from our stolen goods.
Exactly that. Because it's like, if you weren't going to keep it, then why not just give it back? But it's like, nah, capitalism wins out. We're gonna make our money. We're gonna make Margaret Thatcher proud. We're gonna keep it rocking. So let us continue neoliberalism. But yeah.
Yeah. And then my last thing here, I don't know if this made it into the game, but I was listening to an interview with the creator of the game, and she said that the inspiration from the game came from a visit to the British Museum where they saw an entire Turkish building inside the British Museum, and we're like, what would it mean to take this back? So I think we've been talking about small things, but many of the looted things in these museums are monumental.
Yeah.
And the prospect of returning them is even more daunting than I think we've set up.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because the British Museum is rougher in some of these cases, because I believe they also have things from non-Black civilizations like Greece. I believe there are things within the Athenian Museum that they're like, well, the British Museum hasn't given back yet.
Oh yeah, Greece is super angry at the British Museum. Yeah.
Exactly, right. So it's I will give them that, is that they will loot, they are equal opportunity looters. With that being said, DEI looting aside, it would mean a lot, right? Because the joke is that, like, if the British Museum gave back everything they stole, then it would be empty, right? It is, they understand what they've done, they've understand what it is. The game actually tells you who forms the British Museum, because the British Museum is started off of the looting of one man taking all a bunch of stuff from Africa and then giving up his 70,000 items. It's literally born of looted items. So the British Museum, from its origin, is a nefarious instrument. And there's this quote later on in the game where it's like the villain, the last white villain, British villain, it's like they display museum artifacts like a hunter displays his big game, right? And like heads hung on a wall rather than artifacts in a museum, right? And the irony is that the British Museum is not far off from doing that, right? It is the celebration in many ways of their conquest, right? This is what the old empire has to show for its many voyages, and we're not just going to give that up without a fight because we won the fight. If there was any moral backbone or moral givings within any of these institutions, things would be repatriated. And if they were worried about it not being displayed properly, you can help out. You can offer your time and your expertise into building up, proper sites of restoration and places along with the African people, but you're not, right? So it's all bullshit.
I mean, it's so telling, right? That these museums are literally sitting empty, waiting for these artifacts. And yet the argument that we hear constantly in public discourse about this issue is Africa doesn't have a way to display these.
Yeah.
And repatriating them will mean that no one sees them again. It's absurd.
Yeah, absolutely absurd.
Another argument that comes up against repatriation, I mean, a lot of it's delay. A lot of it is just, oh, there's not a process. We're working on the process.
We're working on our provenance research.
Yeah, we're working on our provenance research. I saw a paper which called it filibustering, but it basically is, it's just dragging it out indefinitely.
Yep.
But another real argument that comes up is that people will say this is the heritage of humanity now. So instead of it being the heritage of specific nations in Africa, it is the heritage of humanity. And who better to steward the heritage of humanity than the British Museum or the Louvre or something? And so there's this argument that more people will come and see it, but not acknowledging, of course, the parallel that for people from Africa to travel to England or France is often very difficult. Visas are restricted. So it's not actually available in the same way. When it's claimed as universal human heritage, it becomes something stewarded by white Europe and white United States.
Yeah, I think that argument is awful, actually.
It's terrible. No, it's horrible. I wasn't trying to give it a
I
solid
know.
voice.
No. I know you're just telling me the argument in some of these cases. No, I think that's problematic argument for lots of reasons, right? So if you say that it's the culture of humans or humanity or any of these cases, that leads back into hierarchical thinking of who sort of sits at the top of humanity, right? This gets back to all of this sort of European thinking of just like we're at the top and everybody we colonize and move along sits at the bottom. So we have the most access in any of these cases. One, it's leading into all these problems in the fact that why are you the best quote unquote place to display this? Why are you sitting on the wealth that you have taken and stripped from other nations, not just Africa, but East Asia and all these other places? So that's one. It also means that you are going to be eliminating tourism from the countries that folks might want to see it and help them uplift themselves. If you look at, say, the work of Sylvia Wynter in terms of what the human category actually is, often Black individuals, especially those from the African continent, aren't necessarily viewed as human, even though like no British museum representative will say, oh, we don't view Africans as human. But the treatment and the tacit recognition or a lack of recognition for these spaces and for these countries is more or less saying that you don't reach our level of civilization, you don't reach our level of humanity.
You're hitting one of my pet topics, which is the relation between art and humanity. And so there is such a long history of saying that being able to make art makes you human in multiple ways. And so when that artistic heritage is stripped, the evidence of human achievement is somehow stripped, but also the ways that people are able to engage with their own art and continue to make things, continue to bind together over creative practices is also stripped through the looting. So there's a dehumanization in like two senses.
Yeah.
One from the European sense of not being able to see the evidence of humanity, and two from the actual the local sense of having those practices that bind you to other humans deflated.
Yeah. I think you're 100% right, and art obviously is pivotal to the soul of humanity, despite elephants and crows being able to make artistic and whatnot themselves. But
that was a good shout out. I appreciate that.
I mean, outside of the interspecies, conversation, which is one worth having, there's just a sad reality in that it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's like, they're saying these folks aren't capable of taking care of it or displaying or building a civilization that is worth displaying this art within. But if you don't begin returning, whether it be in the form of reparations or repatriation, the wealth that you have taken out of these nations to build up this global Western empire, then these countries will begin to struggle. It is a constant theme where the global North continues to put their foot on the necks of the global South. And this is one of the ways in which that it takes place, just through artistic fashion, right? You can't have your paintings because you're not, quote unquote, this A, B, or C, smart enough, human enough, whatever it may be. And it is a culturalistic version of the violence that the global North, continues to ship to the South.
And it's a constantly the goalpost moving kind of argument too,
Yeah.
right? So for several centuries, Europeans related to African art by basically not acknowledging it as art, right? They finally in the 20th century, early 20th century, start to acknowledge the value of African art, only to then say, and that's why Africa can't have this art, right? So, I mean, I'm almost thinking ahead, like if and when this art is repatriated, what will be the next goalpost shifting move of white Europe? Because there's going to be one.
It'll be expertise. It'll be like, sure, it's there, but all of the experts on African art, all of the books, all of the resources are still going to be housed in European universities.
Right.
And yeah, I don't necessarily think you're wrong. I just think it's what Mariel brings up is such a fascinating point, because the game points out in one of the heists that you make, I'm forgetting the object, but basically when one of the British captains, one of them could not believe the empire in Nigeria could make the art that they were making. So his whole plan was to steal it all away so no one could put two and two together, right? And this is something that you see constantly. And I know people make jokes about it when it's like, when white people are like, hey, like aliens built the pyramid because they couldn't believe, folks
Right.
with brown skin did it, right? It is one of those aspects where they refuse the refusal of ability or of capacity to create this level of art or welding or many of the other things, because we all know that Africa was quite advanced at both bronze and gold and ironworks, in many cases far more so than some European countries at the same time periods. By denying that level of capacity, you deny their humanity and allow for the arguments of to say, hey, it's okay if we enslave those people. They don't have the same capacities as us. It's linked with aspects of racial capitalism that says, hey, not only do we get to continue justifying taking these objects, we also get to make a bunch of money off of it. And why else are we in Africa if not to make money?
What you're saying, Akil, it reminds me of, there's this notorious quote, which, when I'm teaching about the history of race science, I often open up with students reading this letter from Thomas Jefferson, where he says, I have never seen a slave write a symphony. And it's like, why not? Why not, you fight? Like but for him, you're right, it justifies, right? I've never seen a slave write a symphony, so they're not as human as us. It's the explicit postulate of the letter, and therefore slavery's fine. And I can keep on, making this enormous fortune off of the backs of others, right?
So here's a more complete version of that quote. Never even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. In music, they are generally more gifted than the whites, with accurate ears for tune and time. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind, and that's Thomas Jefferson.
So that denial of art carries a lot of weight in terms of profit.
I think it's so funny with Jefferson's quote, because later or around the time, I'm forgetting the exact time, you had Phyllis Wheatley, right, who wrote poetry, right? Being a slave, being a white people didn't believe that she was writing them, right? And it was because of that same sort of ideology where it is okay to enslave people because they are less than. They do not create the art. They do not have the capacity to think coherently. They don't have the capacity to create the beautiful European arts that we're seeing. So thus it is okay to keep them in bondage. And the reality was that Phyllis Whitley denied that, right? Whether it be, Phyllis Whitley or Frederick Douglass or any of these other US well-educated or self-taught Black individuals, there were constant moments where Black individuals continued to prove that not only did we have the capacity for art, that we often excelled at it, because being able to write from the positions of pain and torture resulted in some of the most heartbreakingly beautiful art that you can imagine. And you find the same thing well within the continent, right? It is obviously a falsehood, but it is a falsehood that is proliferated or continues to this day, where if I turn on Fox News, they'll talk about the inherent violent nature of Black individuals and why it was okay for them to be arrested, murdered, or jailed.
I'm going to go grab a book from my shelf that I want to read a little bit of.
Please.
I want to add in Ishmael Reed on the perceived threat to white civilization from the repatriation of artifacts. Yeah. So I'll just intro this and read it, and then hopefully you all will want to respond in some way. Okay, so as we've been preparing for this conversation about Relooted, Ishmael Reed's 1973 novel Mumbo Jumbo has been on my mind a lot, because in this book there is a subplot about a multi-ethnic group of New Yorkers who learned about stolen art in their college art history class in New York City, maybe at a CUNY school, for instance. And they respond to this injustice by creating a cell that is going to go into the Met and other New York museums and steal the art back. So very much in keeping with the themes of the game. But one thing that I really like about Reed's treatment of this topic is that he points out that for white civilizational projects, it's not just about a refusal to recognize the humanity of other civilizations. It's also experienced as a threat to white civilization itself to be able to recognize other civilizational projects. Mm-hmm. And so in this scene that I'm going to read to you from, we have a character named Thor Wintergreen, who is a young white scion of a very privileged family, who had made common cause with the art relooters, and he was trying to be down with the struggle. But he now finds himself in a situation where, while the heist is going on, the relooters have taken hostage the white chief of police. Or I'm sorry, he used to be police. Now he works as the head of museum security. His name is Biff Musselwhite. And so Thor, not being trusted to do much of the relooting himself, has been tasked with watching over this hostage, making sure he doesn't get in the way. And Biff is trying to talk himself out of this bind, trying to convince Thor to join the side of the whites. So Biff says to Thor, "Son, this is an N-word closing in on our mysteries, and soon he will be asking our civilization to come quietly. This man is talking about Judeo-Christian culture, Christianity, atonism, whatever you want to call it. The most noteworthy achievements of anybody anywhere in the whole universe." And then he starts to laugh. His head in his hands, Biff Musselwhite begins to sob quietly. Stop it, Thor says, pacing the room nervously. "I've seen them, son, in Africa, China. They're not like us, son, the Herrenvolk. Europe, this place. They are lagging behind, son, and you know it in your heart that this is true. Son, these N-words writing, profaning our sacred words, taking them from us and beating them on the anvil of boogie woogie, putting their black hands on them so that they shine like burnished amulets. Taking our words, son, these filthy N-words, and using them like they were their God-given pussy. Why one of them dared to interpret, critically mind you, the great Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Stop it!" Thor sits down on the bench and begins to cry. Musselwhite, seeing that he has made a dent, continues. "That's what it comes down to, son. They're the ones who must change, not us. They must adapt to our ways, producing Elizabethan poets. They should have Stravinsky's and Mozart's in the wings. They must become civilized." Thor, crying, continues to sit at the table. Musselwhite, softly, gently. Son, come and untie me, son. And together, my young valiant prince, we will do battle with the dragons of Justgru. Helen and Mutafika too. You know how she is, fickle, unreliable. You remember what Goethe said. Helen goes the way of euphoria. No, he said, euphorion. Yes, of course, son. You know the bitch. My great book hasn't arrived this month. The mails are slow. Thor finishes untying Musselwhite. Musselwhite rises from the chair and begins to massage his wrists. And scene.
Yeah, no, I have to pick the book up now. No, I think that's fascinating, mostly because it is so relatable to like modern day arguments of replacement theory and while I am not a class reductionist by any means, right, a lot of the racialization or the dehumanization of non-white bodies really became expedited when they needed a good justification for chattel slavery, right? For the triangle trade, for, the Middle Passage to be a thing, and why was it okay to bring these bodies to another place when the natives of that land would either break away or refuse to work in those cases, right? So the fear really has implanted. I don't even want to say subconsciously because there is definitely, individuals who are pushing this and continuing on, but it has resulted in a really deep-rooted belief that if the people of the global South are not controlled and hemmed properly in terms of this white man's burden, that they will be the reckoning of the entire like empire of whiteness. I mean, obviously these are fictional characters, but there are plenty of examples of from like Steve Bannon on of why these aren't just fictional beliefs, right? Like the KKK's whole like mounting argument, if these black people are free, they're going to rape our white wives and destroy our land and do all this other aspects. So it makes sense that even when talking about repatriation or the returning of artifacts, that that it's not just a method of dehumanization, but a method of active control.
Active control and active violence, as you're highlighting.
Yeah.
So this game is an interesting counter to what we've been talking about, right? Like not just in the imaginary of taking this material back, but also in positioning the agency in the hands of the African characters themselves that are doing it and imagining a certain amount of capacity on the game makers, on the game itself. I mean, similarly in this Mumbo Jumbo quote that you just read us, Mariel, there's something about being the actor, so not waiting for Europe to do it for you, that sort of changes the tone of the game. I was wondering if we could talk about like what the game accomplishes in a sense of, in its own right, challenging this wider logic.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So I mean, in terms of like histories of like Afrofuturism and right, Afrofuturism is, and lots of Black speculative fiction is very, very closely tied to histories of Black nationalism and the need to sort of create and find new space, right? The beauty of Afrofuturism is that it seeks to create or imagine new worlds and new spaces because the ones that we exist in just kind of suck, right? So you have all of these needs to not just repatriate artifacts, but to repatriate people, right? And there's been all these Pan-African movements to try to like get Black people to leave the project of the US and head back to Africa, whether it be Marcus Garvey or Martin Delany. The engagement with Afrofuturism is fascinating because of this need to look for a new space, right? And that's of course very closely tied to ideas of Black futurism, of folks like Octavia Butler and Sun Ra, the jazz musician and other things like that, who really just imagine like this Egyptian, this pseudo-Egyptian pharaoh-esque like space colony for Black people to leave the planet because, as Fanon says, we are of cosmic effluvium, right? So there's all this belief that because Black people have been dehumanized so fervently, we'll take that dehumanization and say, fine, we are not of this planet. We are of the stars, and we will go beyond and move this other and move beyond it and look for places that we can actually find homes in. And the game is very, very fascinating because it doesn't necessarily engage with that history. While it claims to be an African futurist project, not to be mistaken with an Afrofuturist project, there has been an ongoing debate of African futurism needing its own sort of space because the thinking that comes out of the continent and the histories that come out of the continent is very different from the histories that come out of the US and the Caribbean. But a lot of the themes that African and Afrofuturism engages in terms of this needing to sort of abandon the body and abandon the world is not within the themes of Relooted. Relooted is African futurism in almost aesthetics alone, right? Which is perfectly fine because the reality is that any speculative, fiction is a critique of what's happening now and sort of hopes for the future rather than like actually some sort of Nostradamus-esque, prediction of what's actually going to happen or, what spaceship we should get into tomorrow and head off in any of these cases. So the game really is, it really is just like it is a high-tech setting of an Africa that is more or less recovered from the scars of colonialism, at least in infrastructure, but is now looking to recover from the scars, the cultural scars left from the looting, as they use the technology that are given and then take back what they have. And in this way, it's a wonderful setting to sort of engage with both the culture of the objects and the African culture. So even if I feel like it isn't the greatest exploration of African futurist themes, the setting and what it does is fantastic for, a school age to teenage player base that this might very well be their first time experiencing some of these artifacts or some of these cultures, having only learned what the US K through 12 might teach them and then lacking in any form of Black history because many folks are not taking, a Black history course in college or in school and I think the setting is a good way to bring people in because folks understand flying cars, folks understand, the ability to hack on a computer with a robotic arm or any of these other aspects, but seeing it in a setting that is almost Wakanda-esque because people have, all this Black Panther imagery in their minds recently, thanks to Disney, is a really good setup to talk about the violence of looting and colonialism, which the game does not shy away from. So the game, while short, really made sure to grab powerful items that'll get people really, really interested. I found myself stopping playing, Googling, putting stuff down, looking into the wider histories. And maybe that's just because I'm a nerd, but I hope that the majority of people playing this game will also be similarly invigorated or invigiled to go play and find, the histories that this game engages with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, I totally take your point that there's so much more to Afrofuturism and African futurism that's not just the aesthetics. But I also can't help but think that, especially if we're thinking about youth playing this video game, it was so smart of the devs to just focus in on the aesthetic part of it. Yeah. Like I was thinking about this preparing for our call. A couple of weeks ago, I taught about Afrofuturism in a freshman year class, and I had a slide where I had just like an image from an image of Wakanda as part of the slide, and I didn't mention it at all. And as soon as I got to that slide, I had like kids frantically waving their hands in class to interrupt the lecture to be like, I know what that's from, right? And especially for a game that engages history in these ways that are so consistent with the Afrofuturist tradition, to be able to firmly ground that engagement with history in the future rather than as like kind of a dusty sort of relic hunting kind of vibe. Like it's the opposite of Indiana Jones in some ways, right? Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I was actually going to say that. I was like, less Indiana Jones, more Afrofuturist. And I think you're 100% right. I think that even in the setting of a game, is sometimes the first things that folk look into, right? It's the aesthetic, it's the design, and they were really great for doing that. So I mean, my critique is more nitpicky, which is okay, because this is what happens when you have to read a bunch of Afrofuturist books and text on it, right? But outside of being like the nitpicky, grouchy professor, I think that the game does a lot of great things, right? And even as I'm playing the last level, which spoiler alert for folks is basically the looting of a last minute British villain that comes to steal all of your artifacts, and then you have to go steal it back. And then it's sort of like a clip show episode of like going through all of your greatest hits, reclaiming the artifacts that you've taken, relearning about them a second time as you've gone through the game. The music, it plays immediately as you start the level. There is African chanting music that's going on in the back. The sound design for the game is amazing. The mixture of the high-tech beeps and sounds, along with the chanting, along with the song, along with the designs, it is a great experience. And while I definitely have critiques on how I got there, I really did sit back and say like, yeah, this is pretty dope. I'm not gonna lie. Like I would have never in a thousand years thought I'd be playing Afrofuturistic or African futuristic, video game in the big 2026. So good on Nyankopop for doing that.
Yeah. On the education point, I think I was watching as I prepared like a online review, so somebody who plays through and tells you about their experience. I don't know this person. I think it's Carlec or Carl C. But they said something really interesting, which is that you get exposed to all of these looted objects and you collect them on kind of a page where the different objects are set up. And he said it's kind of like a digital museum. So you have a museum to these looted objects, exploring their absence, exploring their history in the form of the game itself, which I thought was a really interesting comment and a really interesting way of thinking about both what the game accomplishes and what you might learn from it.
This is actually where video games, I think, are incredibly successful at, right? So video games for a long time have done this through the sort of special rewards and collections that you get within it. So if you play Resident Evil 4 or Smash Bros is probably the best example of this, a Nintendo game that is super duper famous, you collect trophies all throughout the game. And when you look at those trophies, it gives you information about where that piece of game came from or where this trophy comes from. Smash Bros really works as a museum of basically of Japanese video games when you play through it and you collect all these games. And while most people are playing it for the competitive aspect, if you really care about the histories of video games, Smash Bros is actually a fantastic game to slowly get into learning about Chibi Robo and all these other aspects that are there, whether it be Sonic the Hedgehog or Mega Man or all of these other things that come within the game. And this is where video games as a form of digital archiving can really be helpful because it becomes a playable museum, which has been done. VR has been playing around with virtual museums and visiting places and doing this other stuff. But folks who just want to see the object and play, it is much simpler for a designer to create a digital copy of it and just tell you the history of it as you go along. So it is. Video games have done this, Assassin's Creed, other stuff like that. But it is sad because we live in a very political time, but lots of video games are often viewed to be apolitical, despite them being some of the most political objects you can engage with. But because of that sort of fear of disrupting this sort of apolitical equilibrium, a lot of companies have strayed away from teaching important histories that can very, very well be done within this sort of museum aspect of a game where, if you don't want to see it, you don't even have to. But if you go and interact with all the special features, you can see more than just the designers' names and little behind the scenes stuff. You can learn, major histories of the world. And I wish more video games would do that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I did want to go back to your distinction between African and Afrofuturist, just because one thing which stood out to me in this game is the diversity of African characters within it.
Yeah.
And I do think Afro-American views of Africa can sometimes homogenize the continent, much as white American views of Africa can treat Africa as a country.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting, like early in the game, it looks like you're meeting someone from Senegal. The game is set in South Africa. Someone's been to Tanzania, and you have these motions, and their distinct histories are meaningful within the game. One of the characters is complaining they can't get, I think, Senegalese food in South Africa. So these differences of place within Africa are spelled out for you in the game. I think that's really interesting and important.
Yeah, I mean, largely the differences between African and Afrofuturism, while being more pronounced these days through authors that are trying to create that sort of difference, is largely just the sort of divergent histories of the impacts of slavery and post-colonialism, right? Like what unique histories are born out of US and Caribbean experiences, which I wouldn't be surprised if somebody starts coming out with a Afro-Caribbean futurism, and then the differences of the continued damage towards the African continent in and of itself. I 100% agree with you that even African Americans tend to sometimes have a weaker understanding of what the continent is, because that's just the reality of what colonialism did, right? It erased and it separated us from those histories, which is why, when my sister did her 28 and Me or whatever, 22 and Me, whatever, and she was like, "Oh, we're mostly West African." I was like, "Yeah, no shit, slavery." And speaking to that, has been more of an active effort to fight against the homogenization, right? Exactly what Niam Makop is doing. And when they say like, "Hey, we don't want to homogenize the African continent," right? And like we pointed out, Ndedi, who was from Cameroon, is like, "I can't get Cameroonian food," right? And this is also where the interest with accents utilizations within the game, right? Giving folks South African accents or Cameroonian or Nigerian accents as they go along. While there is some still like stereotypes in terms of like African warmongers or specifically like African, trades dealers and other things like that, I will forgive the game for that, because it's not that you can't have African warlords or, illegal traders, just African villains in and of themselves. It is just quite often when you have an African villain, they are the only African within the entirety of the game, and then they become the sole representation for that culture, and then typically blackness in entirety of itself. With a game that is so filled with so many different types of black representation, I will forgive them for leaning into one or two stereotypes just for the sake of having stakes in their game as they create conflict and measure that any good story or narrative, would have. But the realities of that is just that the game does this fairly well. I'm a little concerned in terms of why they gave Nomali and Trevor a more Western sounding accent than the rest of the cast, but voice acting is something that I go back and forth with. Like it is amazing to hear these accents and some of this stuff, but the directions that were given was definitely kind of weak. There was a lot of lag within the speaking. Sometimes folks would just like say something and then it would take like a couple seconds and then they would finish their statement. So there are definitely some things that I feel like they could have cleaned up on, but being an indie studio, I'm not too worried about this.
Great. So you were mentioning your critiques, and that's obviously one of them or part of one of them. Where else are you critical?
Mostly in terms of this would come more out of the design aspect. I have yet to make a game fully myself. There are lots of things you pick up and things that I've obviously been learning, but in terms of gameplay loop, which is a very common game design sort of discussion, the gameplay loop can be a little tedious and gratuitous, especially amongst the many needs for tutorials within the game, which if we're leaning towards a school age crowd, I understand, but with the the leaning towards sometimes using curse words, sometimes collecting some more harsher parts of history, this is definitely leaning like 14 plus. And I feel like a 14-year-old doesn't need 7 tutorials to do what many of the things they need to do. There's a difficulty of where every time you unlock a new character, you need to run 1 or 2 tutorial rounds with them, which eats up. It definitely feels like fluffing of the game in some of these cases, which I get it, it's a short game, but I think I would have preferred a shorter experience rather than having all that fluff go along. The gameplay, the puzzle solving is the best part of the game, and as well as the ability to run fast and escape towards the escapes of every mission. But a lot of that can become repetitive. Sometimes it just feels like I'm pushing a table just to push a table rather than figure out the puzzle. But that doesn't overstay its welcome for too long, which is perfectly fine. And then some of the introductions of the characters feel very, very, very late, but this is something that like JRPGs have been dealing with forever. Everybody always complains about there's one character that joins the party too late and they wish they had more time with them. But yeah, overall, the game design is a little choppy and the animation is solid. It gives me like Sid the Science Kid, if anybody knows that PBS show, kind of movements and feel in terms of its aesthetic, but it's still a beautiful game. The music is there. There's a lot of heart and soul in this, and I've played far, far, far choppier games. So I am really impressed with what Niamacock did. So
Awesome. So I guess on that note, those are your critiques, but when you go into Xbox to buy the game, you get a lot of other critiques, and some of them seem less or more disingenuous, let's say, less sincere. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the coordinated attack on the game and what that means for video gaming more generally.
yeah, so this is, I guess, more my wheelhouse and my specialization in terms of culture and games, despite, loving the history of it. The reality is that video games, right, because of the history of video games. But long story short, the history of video games has resulted in it being a very sort of like white masculine space, right? When video games nearly were erased from the US in the crash of 83 and 84, video games in the US were revived through the hands of Nintendo, actually, right? But when Nintendo were getting ready to sell their games in the US, they had to choose an aisle, whether it be the boys. They sold it as a toy, basically to avoid the relation to computers and the sort of stigma that had come along with games during the crash of 83. As selling it as a toy, they had to pick a line within the US, either be in the boys aisle or the girls aisle, and they went with the boys. All of the marketing afterwards made that video games were a very masculine space, whether it was, are you man enough to save the princess when Zelda commercials came on, or, violence or using sexuality to sell to young boys, essentially meant that like video games really, really, really within the late 80s and early 90s entrenched itself as a masculine sort of space. And there's lots of folks who talk about this, like Carly Cursor calling this like techno masculinity. And then video games, as she points out, becomes a sort of stepping stone for young boys to get into tech and then blast off into their Silicon Valley dreams and blah blah blah, all these other spaces. But something that is often forgotten within this is not just the gendered aspect of it, but the racial and class aspects that came along with it. That because these games are often finding themselves within the homes of young white boys, which is an ironic sort of shift of bringing men back into the domestic sphere at young ages, meant that many of these were middle to upper middle class families. Once the arcade scene started dying down, it meant that you had to buy what were often pricey consoles, and it resulted in a proliferation of whiteness and maleness becoming the default. This is where we get the stereotypes of video game players being these young white men in their basements with like Cheeto dust and Mountain Dew, right?
Right.
And with this identity, folks have embraced it, unfortunately, and it's become a real problem anytime companies seek to break away from the legends of yore of video games being a white space, or anytime they bring women or people of color, BIPOC folks, whatever you want to say, into these games, it is often met with massive resistance. So the most perfect example of this is Gamergate, which is still to this day, the most cited thing amongst a lot of game scholars and gamer folks, more conservative gamer folks and more left-leaning gamer folks still argue about what was the cause. And so Gamergate was basically a big hate campaign that targeted women and people of color in a long, massive campaign against folks like Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian, basically doxing, harassing, and assaulting all of these individuals. And we've seen from that moment, right, that watershed moment, that video games continue to be a very racialized and often racist space. And it's something that has happened with the attack of Sweet Baby Games in terms of quote unquote Gamergate 2, which was a company owned by a Black woman that did work on games like God of War and other things like that, where people were like, well, they're making the games too woke, so clearly this is the culprit, and attack them. And something that happened with Assassin's Creed Shadows, where because they brought Yasuke into the Assassin's Creed aspects, and they were like, why is a Black man in a Japanese style video game? People lost their minds. There's long histories to this. the South basically rides again every time there's a black character that is released. Instead of burning crosses on someone's lawn, they go in and leave lots and lots and lots of bad reviews to try to hurt this game, because they know that in a capitalist system, money is the end all be all, and if they can hurt the economic status of these companies, then these companies will be far less likely to try and do it again. And yeah, even when Relooted came out, and I made a little Twitter post, and I'm just like, hey guys, this is a cool game from a South African company. Go check it out if you're interested. Like 6, 7, 10, 11 folks just randomly came on and was like, hey, this isn't a real game. Nobody's playing this. Why would you ever, support this? You're just a tourist, which is basically like I'm a fake gamer. And they just bombasted me with just racist crap for like 3 days. And I was like, okay, this is fun. All I said was, hey, check out Relooted.
I was reading a thing on Reddit where someone had a similar experience. The person says, I am a South African aspiring game developer, and the gaming industry, from my personal experience, is quite small. When I heard that one of our bigger studios was doing a new game, I was excited, but that excitement was quickly tempered by the attention the game started receiving from reactionary Western audiences. Before the game even had anything to show, there was all of this vitriol thrown at it. I'd hoped they would forget about the game, and I Am a Cop could just focus on doing their own thing. But lo and behold, I search for the game now, and the top results are from misogynists. It hits quite close to home physically and emotionally to see bad faith critics becoming the loudest voices speaking on this game. And I thought that was interesting, like because they identified as a South African aspiring developer, someone who like feels themselves being hit directly by this hate campaign. And you can see like the spiral effects that this has.
Yeah. The reality, I mean, this is something that happens a lot, and even some points that I've mentioned when talking about like why aren't there more black folks in like PC esports, right? The space is made so deleterious and toxic that if there were black aspiring esports players, that they don't really want to join because they'd have to wade through all the sludge and swamp before they got there. And this is a problem, right? Because only about 3% now of game developers in the US are black. And when you count that globally, the number starts to shrink. It is very, very sad because so many black individuals, whether they be from the US or from the continent, do not feel like making games is a viable option for them. Not only because that would mean taking a risk in a very, very volatile market, as you've seen companies like Epic Games, the creators of Fortnite and other things, start laying off thousands of employees. Video games is a very, very volatile economic space, one that is very, very scary to be in. All my LinkedIn is filled with, black developers, black games folk that have either lost their job or looking for work, and it is very, very sad that many of them cannot seem to find jobs despite having a massive love for video games. The reality of it is that the game itself was in a very, very rough place from the beginning, right? If we understand that Black women tend to be at the very axis of these negative powers because they suffer not only for being obviously women, but also being Black, where as Black men get, male privilege, white women get, white privilege. So the main character being a Black woman, Nomali, already set it up to be in the crosshairs of some of the worst people. The other funny thing about this is that it also set it up to be targeted by more of the intelligentsia, ones who are more beholden towards these sort of old ways of defending museum practices and upholding sort of white colonial practices, because the game directly targets those within museum studies that think that we should keep these artifacts or hold on to it. And while I would like to say educated individuals are free from these racist ideologies, many of them are not. Many of them fall back onto anthropologists and archaeologists alike can fall back into being quite defensive. So this game kind of hits a lot of people where it hurts. And that set it up to not only be targeted by some of the more bigoted game players, but also meant that it wasn't really going to be defended by some of the individuals that have the vocabulary to defend it. Not to mention it's an indie game, so it didn't have any sort of like big studio money to advertise and to protect it going forward. And it's resulted in Yamka not really knowing what they want to do next, right? A friend of mine spoke to one of the developers on the game, and they were like, they're really proud of their work, but this is by far the biggest game that they've ever made, and they're not sure if it's for the right reasons, right? Like it's gotten the most attention out of anything they've ever made, but it's been equally negative and good. I'm not sure they'll make another game like this going forward. Maybe they'll ride this wave of publicity and make something that is not as racially charged, but I hope they do. I hope they come out and make something even more aggressive in whatever it is. Maybe they'll have a Haitian Revolution game. I'd buy it.
I'd buy it too.
Although there is an old school Haitian Revolution-esque game made by
Really?
a French, a very, very early, one of the earliest, if not the first Black woman game developer, made a game called it's Mawillo. It might be Mawillo or Mawillo Freedom Journeys, and that whole game is basically just a slave rebellion in video game form. It's an old PC game.
Wow.
Far out.
Man.
Mariel, what do you think we're taking away from this?
I think for me, the takeaway really comes in exactly that contradiction that the two of you were just laying out. That this is a South African gaming company that doesn't have a lot of resources compared to like major studios. They set out to do something quite ambitious. And sidebar, like I did not play this game prior to us recording this episode because I don't even own a gaming system. Like this is so not my universe of stuff, probably because when I was in middle school, my experience of video games was that my female friends and I would go over to our male friends' houses. They would play the video games and have the controllers, and we would sit behind them and watch them play the game. So, thinking about the gender aspect of that, all of which is to say, the whole video gaming space is very far outside of my wheelhouse, but it sounds like this is a studio that accomplished what they set out to do. And what they set out to do, like making an actually entertaining edutainment game where there's real gameplay and the learning happens organically and isn't just kind of a trudging through an environment. That was in and of itself an ambitious project. And then layered on top of that, you have the racial politics of it, right? And also not incidentally, like thinking about a studio in South Africa, right? That racial capitalism element, I think, comes through really strongly as well, right? This is a company trying to succeed in an economy that is set up to extract resources from South Africa, not to recirculate resources there. And in some ways, that's what we see in the hate campaigns against the game, is kind of a hatred of the idea that a South African studio would dare to, from the point of view of the crossburners, intrude on like American racial politics, right? Because the game is not being received as a South African game. It's being received as an intervention into the American politics of race, right? So I think for me, the most striking thing about all of this is seeing the ways in which the racial dynamics of the art world that we started the episode with are replicated in these kind of fractal ways in the artistic world of video gaming.
Yeah, that's a great take. I think I'm just left sitting, this is hardly the most important takeaway from the conversation, but something Akil said in that last comment about the intelligentsia, the museum workers who oppose this game because it suggests the corruption of the museum system as a whole, demands that we steal these artifacts back. And obviously, like that's the moral thing to do, right? Is to steal these artifacts back, return them to where they belong. I don't think that solves the historic problem of colonialism, but it does point to the rot at the center of our colonial system, of our museum system, of our art system. And I think it's a really powerful thing for the game to achieve.
I agree.
Last thoughts, Akil?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with all of that. I've yapped quite a bit, so I'll keep it short, but the game is a beautiful experience. As a Black man who, only gets to see himself really depicted in the most violent aspects. And while, there's representation is getting much, 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 much better, I still find that playing a game that is so rooted within African culture is still a liberating aspect and something beautiful to engage with, even if it is in a sort of Pan-Africanist way in many of these cases where I've only visited the continent. I don't have the strongest ties to it due to the histories of colonialism. It is still nice to be able to learn and engage with it in these ways. I hope that other Black countries from the global South get to make beautiful things. I'm waiting for that Caribbean Trinidadian game. It's gonna hit. I love it. I want to see it. But if you get the chance to support it or play it in any of these cases, I recommend you do. It's not the most expensive game, and it's not a very long game. And even with all of the growing pains that are in the game, I still think it's worthwhile playing. So I recommend that folks just do that. They play it. So yeah.
Well, thanks. This has been a great conversation. I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you so much, Akil. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Hope we're able to bring you back to talk about, Descent Low Overture or something, the video game in in a year or two.
That would be fantastic. We all heard it here first. It's got to be Haitian Revolution, the video game. It's gonna go crazy. We got to get like Rockstar to do it instead of Grand Theft Auto 6. Just put it down, start making Haitian Revolution the video game. But thank you so much for having me, Colin, Mariel. This was great. I will get some water from all the yapping I did, but I appreciate the opportunity to do so.
We're supposed to ask if you have anything you want to plug.
Anything I want to plug? Ooh, this is a rough one. I'd love to give a shout out because plugging is always something I'm bad at. I'll give a shout out quickly. There's a lot of great work on Black games. Kishonna Gray, Samantha Blackman, Triandra Russworm. You're interested in that? It is a Lindsay Grace. It is a small but growing literature. One that I am doing my best to add to continuously. If you want to read any of my work, Google Scholar is there. Still working on my book, Playing in Color, How Black Gamers Build Worlds, and hopefully that'll be out in like the next 2 years or so. Other than that, any support folks can give towards Niam Kapop and plays. And I know if I've butchered that name 100 times, so apologies everybody. I'm sorry I didn't say it right, but I had the spirit. I had the right spirit of it. But
That's right.
Niamakop, I think is also great to support them. And if you can find any other games made by Black indie developers, Momo Pixel, Aerial Knight, folks like that, please go play their games. I think it'll be great. And I for one have not been the best at following all of the games scenes that are happening within the continent, but I hope that all of you, like me, will pay more attention to South Africa and Nigeria and other places that really cool stuff is being made and hopefully get it, more attention. So, yeah.
Great plug. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I'm excited to read your book when it comes out, and I and everyone else should go play this game and check out the other developers you mentioned. So, thanks so much. And listeners, you've been listening to Bad Art, podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. Please remember to like, subscribe, review, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.